only during that time frame. So there are a few limitations, but if you're just looking for a seamless integration with multiple GCP, then Composer is the way to go. The reason why we went with Composer, as I said, is we're in the middle of migration and we want to slowly open up our tenants to integrate seamlessly with other services. And also at the same time, lay some ground rules, as in like impose some compliance checker in the way they're integrating with other services, which I'm going to get to it soon. So yeah, the agenda, as you can see, is it talks about the different the problems that we saw initially when we were rolling out Composer and how we kind of were able to mitigate a few issues using the automations we have in place. So yeah, Apache Airflow, the one thing I forgot is like it's open source and it's got great community support. Like if you do have a question or there are people responding to it and actively contributing to it. And I think ever since Composer and the other flavors came about, Google is particularly focusing on all the advancements and enhancement requests. So there's like a quick turnaround too. Extremely scalable, but with few, yeah, there are some caveats to it, but you can have your own Airflow run on a GKE if you're into that. Also, I think it's predominantly Python. It's completely built on Python framework, and it supports Python right out of the box. Like all these pipelines that I'm talking about that you can schedule on will need to be in Python. So there is some learning curve to it. Like it's not just like you can bring your Java code and have it scheduled on Airflow. It still needs to use that Python framework. So there is some learning curve there. All right. So before we get into the whole automation piece, I'm going to talk about how we kind of lay the plumbing for all of the different parts to kind of seamlessly integrate. As you know, kind of Tony kind of went about how we do Terraform in our organization. Terraform is this infrastructure as code that we use to even roll out the Composer automation, Composer environments per project. And we kind of tweak the Airflow. There is a way in Composer you can override the default Airflow settings, and that's something that we're tapping into because we're having multiple tenants getting onboarded onto our projects on a day-to-day basis. We quickly had to figure out a way of adding them or their AD groups and the whole members into the Airflow. Just by having them onboarded onto the Composer isn't enough, we realized, because Airflow has its own access control using RBAC, which needs to be stored locally in its metadata database. That gets tricky very soon. So just the web server over the web Airflow configuration that I'm pointing here kind of helps with that. So what these do is it kind of tells the Composer environment where to look for the DAGs and how do you logically isolate the DAGs that belongs to certain tenants using the RBAC concept we have. So all of the DAGs would be in one Composer bucket under the same folder, but within that folder, this particular parameter here ties the IAM permissions on that folder to that particular tenancy. So as part of our Composer rolling out using Terraform, we make sure that a tenant folder is created under the DAGs bucket, and they have only access to that particular bucket. So they can push all their DAGs into that, and they can only look at those DAGs without crowding their UI. And then for those who don't, and our automation picks on that and make sure it that user, whenever he goes into the web UI, has that role assigned.
Is that only for staging, Dominique?
No, this is at the Composer level. So
he doesn't have to worry about user syncing, leaving AD group, because tenant sync, the sync code part is the abstracted from the
exactly.
Settings.
Yes. Yeah, that's
an advantage.
Yes. So we're kind of using the same Azure AD grouping and the members within it, but then it's abstracted from the Composer. All that, this is just the plumbing in place. So for those Azure AD lookup and then this to kind of go in. Apart from that, we also copy some, there's a nuance that we picked up on, like just by having a folder structure under the DAG isn't going to create that role in the metadata. You need to have like a DAG, a dummy DAG in there, just so it forces the scheduler to create that custom role for you. So that whenever our automation goes in, it wouldn't just say, hey, role not found. Like this is just like a plumbing in place. Like, so it kind of made sense for it to be part of the whole tenant onboarding, because it's all there when the automation goes in to add those people with that role. So quick plumbing.
Is it happening after the effect of project creation or is it happening during?
Well, it's all in the same project, but it's when we bring the tenant on board. So I'm going to go into explaining like how the tenant onboarding happens and how this whole thing works. So that is what this slide is talking about. Special mention about this overriding because this is what triggers the whole multiple, like the whole RBAC thing from using the composer and the AD groups. And also does one more thing, adds our team as an admin on all the composer environments, just so we can kick out people that don't belong there. And just talking on the tenant onboarding, we're all talking about, so CVS is a large organization. We have multiple LOBs, so we have like multiple projects. And for every, let's say we have an enterprise, PBM, PSS, and RET and all stuff, and we have TEV, test, and fraud. So there's a project for each environment and each LOB. So to roll out composer instances, we need to be sure like we know exactly what their use case is. So that is all automated using our intake forms, using Microsoft flows that Bingway has written. So they need to put in their tenancy, their business justification, cost center that it can be charged back to, and all of that stuff. And at the end of the day, whenever we kind of onboard them, like when we run the Terraform to apply that particular new tenant to the destination project, if it is done successfully, then there is a crumb file we leave in the composer bucket in the data folder, which has that new tenants added. So that is one key element to this whole automation, because that's where we know exactly what tenants are part of that composer environment.
Kind of
Per project, exactly. It's like it's a state file.
It's like the current file will have all the new tenants.
Exactly, and all the old files. So that is what the sync automation is going to pick up on, and knows exactly what all themes to sync. So the whole plumbing in place, like exactly how that feature helps us in creating the DAGs, separation within for the RBAC stuff, and also like how the whole automation triggers. And now talking about a little bit information about the tenant account structure, like the service account structure. When we say multi-tenant, it just doesn't, it isn't enough just to say, hey, we got multiple people in, but we need to give them some way or some service accounts so that they can do something with their resources, and some way of impersonating safely, because impersonation is not just composer specific, but rather project specific. So for that, we kind of thought about, most of our tenants are doing big data engineers or data engineers. They all work on PySpark and mostly Hadoop backgrounds. So they have this use case of setting up Dataproc clusters and running their PySpark jobs on it. So even for that, the way we set up the service, so every tenant gets two service accounts. One is a connect service account, we like to call it, and the other is a resource service account. Resource service account is the service account that has access to all their resources and none other. Like, and we have a naming consistency that conforms to that. Like we check. I'm going to get into that a little later. And then connect service account is a special service account within the composer environment. Its whole purpose is to safely impersonate to the tenant's resource service account. The way composer, there is, even though we say composer, we're using it in a multi-tenancy fashion, but Airflow at its core is not multi-tenant. So there's a lot that can go wrong if it is not set properly. So composer, the default service account that is being used to set up our projects has wider permissions, just like any compute engine. So it can get into any PubSub topic or anything. Yep. Just to curb that, we kind of force tenants to run their operators or anything that requires impersonation as a connect guy, because only connect guy can impersonate to their service account. If they want to create a Dataproc cluster, for example, as I said, they have a Dataproc create cluster operator that in they're gonna put they're gonna use impersonation chain, impersonate to their connect service account first, and then while in their Dataproc cluster configuration, put their resource service account, and then this only works if they have the connect service account, because that has the service account user permission that is required to set up resources for the tenants. And this doesn't work anywhere outside of Composer. The connect service account guys' whole and sole responsibility is to be able to set up resources for their tenant using the tenant service account. This way, it kind of, it is a workaround, because we don't want the default Composer service account to be impersonating to every tenancy, and this is the safest way to do that.
So all reads they do via resource SA and then Connect SA is all about create. You impersonate every time you create resource.
Exactly.
That's the concept?
Yep. Because Composer guy has a token creator on the Connect guy and the resource guy, but only Connect guy has a user on the resource, so that it will only be able to.
Resources will have update.
Oh yeah, they can do like everything that it. Yeah, I think they can still go ahead and delete their own resources. Yeah, so they have ultimate control on all the resources that they're spinning
Within
from
the
Composer. Yeah.
So how this will apply for encryption? If I'm using I know for voltage UDF, BigQuery UDF, we have encryption service account and encryption service account. So if I have to run the BigQuery UDF, will I be using the Connect service account as well to run the encryption, or will directly be using the encryption service account?
I think you should directly use the encryption service to do that, and we'll make sure that it has a separate set of permission that lets you do that. But yeah, that's just a brief introduction as to why we have it that way within the Composer, because this kind of structure is required if you are setting them up for success and you don't want some cross-tenancy stuff happening. Yeah, so getting into the automation, the biggest problem is we have like tons of people coming from on-prem and they wanted to try Composer and they have their tenancies onboarded successfully. But the biggest bottleneck is, as I said, Airflow needs all the users in its metadata database, which is, it's completely Airflow specific and nothing that we can do from Composer. So we kind of have this whole automation, which uses multiple aspects. So we have an Azure, at the core of it, what it does is it leaves that CRUM file that I was just pointing at, the tenant groups.txt, that our intake request updates every now and then, every time a new tenant comes. So we have a DAG within our Composer environment that reads that file, knows exactly where new tenants are or all the tenants that needs to be updated, then invokes a cloud function call that is going to do some heavy compilation, like it knows exactly where all the it uses Azure AD. There's an app registration we register within our CVS tenancy Azure Active Directory that we tap into. So that app is what is responsible for getting us all the group and the user level details per AD group. So all you get is a tenant, and this cloud function gets me all the members that are part of the cloud function. And this cloud function part on top of that also compiles the list of roles that a user should be. One user could be part of multiple tenancies. So at the end of it, you have this one big dictionary that with group, user, and role that gets fed into the Airflow DAG. And then ultimately, with the Python branch operator, we decide if the user needs to be added a role, or if some user got deleted and we need to delete it from the Airflow metadata. That's how we keep the whole Azure AD in sync with our Airflow metadata database. Just so.
But is just one gigantic CRUM file, or you maintain per tenant? Still do that.
Yeah, it's just it runs every couple of hours, so we don't mind doing it all on it. But it's sophisticated. The DAG itself is sophisticated. You don't need to run it like a cumulative run. You can so you don't need to run it cumulative. You can just run it on one group, but you run it at the group level for sure. We can't run it on the member level.
Any kind of change. Right?
Oh yeah, right. Our group being the common understanding between the Azure and the thing and the Airflow AD. So that's our kind of the shortest way to get like, hey, how many groups is this user part of, and what are all the roles that needs to be assigned? And so if a user is, let's say, removed from a group, let's say it's part of the wrong group and it got removed, and that gets replicated. It got a little I think there are some questions. Okay.
Oh, Tom, do you want to hit the minus thing next to stop share on the right as well? So
okay.
The huge box on the right goes away. To the right more. To the right.
To the right.
Yeah, this
Oh, this guy.
Yeah.
All right. So far back as the concept of K8s.
Maybe I can.
Yeah, Jonathan, can you go ahead? Yeah, with your question?
Yeah. So since you are already talking about AD, so maybe I start with AD. AD group is already through when we sync in CVS environment into Google Cloud Identity. So are you using IAM or you are using AD?
We're using AD. So the RBAC stuff that I'm talking about is not at the GKE level, Jonathan, but rather at the Airflow level. So Airflow, even though it's run on a GKE, like it has its own RBAC within the, like if somebody has to go to the Airflow web UI, I think the Airflow has its own metadata RBAC that guards like exactly what role this user should be a part of. It uses Flask app builder at the backend. So it has the default admin, ops, user, and all that no DAGs role. But then at the broader, because Airflow at its core is meant for single tenant, it assumed that the role set that it comes with, it assumes that only one tenancy is going to access it. So every time somebody logs in with their composer or whatever IAM permissions they have access to all the DAGs, at least from the UI. So this way, if we kind of create our custom roles within Airflow that ties them back to their AD groups, we are restricting them to only look only with their DAGs, so that when they open the Airflow web UI, they will only be looking at their tenancy DAGs, not the other DAGs.
I see. So basically, RBAC has been also introduced into the
Exactly.
Airflow.
Yeah, Airflow RBAC has always been, but I think it's from starting 1.10.15 that has kind of gained prominence. And that's something that we're strongly leveraging to roll out the multi-tenancy, because I think it gets real messy real soon if you kind of like look at everybody's DAG, and if you can do anything, it beats the whole purpose of the multi-tenancy, the isolation part.
Plus, under the hood, it's GKE running it, right? So you are using RBAC will make sense. The other thing is that, are you using Composer 2.0 or 1.x? Are you using Composer 2.0 or 1.x?
Oh, so yeah, we have these automations for both Composer 1 and 2. It kind of, the whole general concept being the same, like we're tapping into the same Airflow overrides and the same Airflow RBAC, but it's just that the CLI calls that we make implicitly are a little different, because the definitions of the permissions change from Airflow 1 to 2 or Composer 1 to 2 rather.
So you do support both right now, so are you using Composer for just a scheduling purpose, or you are using it for orchestration flow, like a trigger data proc?
I think just an orchestrator. Like they cannot be running any hard, heavy workloads on the Composer right now. All they can do is just trigger so that the whole compute happens on a BigQuery or a Vertex AI or Dataflow or PUPS, whatever. But nothing gets except for some minor Python functions that are required to kind of do some initial setup.
Ideally, you can actually expand the scope in actually having this as a generic queue mechanism. But at the time, you are trying to steal the functionality from BigQuery.
Well, even it's not really stealing, as in like
it's not stealing, but you're trying to overdo some of the idea. This has capability. For example, I can, let's say I'm running a Redis queue, I can channel it via this, because you're still controlling.
It's still an orchestrator. Like all it is doing is all the calls to these respective GCP services flow via Composer, but there's nothing that there's like a chubby baby sitting on the Composer doing all the work. Like even all these all of this is, again, there is this concept called executor versus operator on Airflow, where operator is what we're tapping into right now. We're talking about now. Operator, for you to be able to interact with multiple services, you have this Google provider operators like BigQuery, Execute Query. So they're smart enough to kind of push the load back onto the BigQuery engine rather than just getting the data, or there's no migration, or there's no in-memory storing happening. Rather, they just launch the job to get that job stuff done. Like if you are to query, or if you're to, except for some select queries, which are in the limit of the memory. But mainly as an orchestrator.
You have an option to standardize sort of pockets of queuing mechanism that
Yes.
You can still channel us. Because you still
want Composer to do that. Yes.
Basically have a control. The only thing is you need to integrate with the cloud function. Basically, what action has to take.
Exactly.
You can still do that, but.
But yeah, we want Composer to be like the primary gateway to multiple services. They can still do like a gcloud command to kind of launch a data flow job outside of the composer, but in test and prod, I think we're kind of focusing on like having it all run primarily from composer. Does that answer your question, John?
Yeah. So composer, basically you used it for orchestration purpose. For example, you started a data flow, a data proc, and then data proc is not permanently will be keep running. Once it's a finished job, it's done. That's the best practice, right? And also that question also sounds like you're talking about mainly you use it for orchestration, but for simple scheduling job, are you rely on cloud scheduler, or you also use composer to do the scheduling job?
Right now, we're working without the cloud scheduler. Like we are using heavily composer, like for even a single job. Even if it is a PySpark job, some teams want to run on their cluster, we still use composer for that.
Use composer as a scheduler.
The reason we're doubling down on composer is because of the part that I'll be getting to later in the talk. Because we want to make sure that everything is compliant enough in a multi-tenant, and then we have this custom compliance checker that checks the DAG for an impersonation chain, and which we cannot enforce on a cloud scheduler job, because cloud scheduler there you can run a job with any service account router, because you so we don't want that thing to happen just yet, and I want to be able to quickly tell like, hey, how the impersonation, how did that job run, and exactly what service account has been used to spin up that job, and who exactly impersonated to which service account. All of that can be done seamlessly today in Composer, whereas in Cloud Scheduler, we do not have like.
No, but you miss the integration. I mean, Cloud Scheduler's native integration of other services, right? I mean, that is something that we will miss here. But the other side of it is you are getting the added
benefit. Yes, I think for us, compliance take the thing. It's a trade-off.
Because I also
and also
Cloud Scheduler from the native integration.
But there are some drawbacks. I do not want to get to it,
no,
but
I totally get very well.
Yeah, but the cloud function with a VPC, so a VPC cloud cloud scheduler with
Service
a VPC
controller.
cloud function is it just doesn't work. It like all of the traffic still doesn't flow through VPC. It comes from public space, which is prohibited in a VPC enforced project, like the service parameter project. So that there are like few things that we
can. Yeah, there's a different ways to still make it, but at the time you're trying to.
You can make it work. A VPC service control parameter, you can make it work for sure.
Correct.
And but it's just more wrinkles to configure on that on your cloud function and so on. So last question for me is that because I'm coming from EDP platform and you are actually used A and a BC approach, very different. So I also want to hear is that, do you guys use private service connect to reduce the routable IP consumption?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes,
cool.
we do in Composer too. Yes, Jonathan.
Perfect. Yeah. I have no further question at this moment. Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to quickly move over to the other part of the talk, which is, so we already talked about the Composer RBAC role mapping, but then this slide kind of talks more about the underlying pieces. Now, like I kind of talked about how the Azure AD setup looks like, but just for anyone who has no idea, app registration is nothing but you have an app within the CVS Azure AD tenancy, using which you can query anything, like any object from a user to a group to any permission if you have the right permission set. So
it's a graphic.
It's the using the graphic API, and then using the client library. Our cloud function, every time I say we use the graph library using Azure Identity framework, and then we're using this app registration service principal client secret, and it's kind of like an OIDC authentication you set up within the cloud function and the app that you don't need like any callee kind of a request token is generated for that particular the scope of the request. Then you get the details about the members, group membership, and then you do whatever. The rest is like the token is only good for the OIDC. It's only good for an hour or so. So it's saved that way. And Cloud Function does this heavy lifting of looking at the member user details that the Azure app provides us, and then looking at the tenant and trying to compile that exact role that this user should be part of. And this should match the DAG folder name that we're putting there, because that having an extra folder that we're using, the preview feature that I talked about, that should exactly match with what this cloud function is spitting out, or else like that, because having another folder per tenant under the DAG folder like I talked about, that is what creates the role. And this cloud function or whatever is assigning to every member should match that.
So you
So the
created
folder-
where the folder name?
Yeah.
How do you do?
So I was talking about the preview feature in the beginning, where I think I'll probably get to it in a demo, but just to quickly show, this is the composer environment. And I was talking about the overrides here, which you can see from here.
Okay.
Yep. So auto register per folder. This is what creates a subfolder. Like every time there's a subfolder within the DAG, this feature creates a custom role if there is a DAG object inside it in the Airflow metadata database. That is how FDM, PSL, or even any tenancy within our organization gets a custom role. There is no, like, I'm not going in to create that, punch in that role for you in the metadata, rather a composer is doing that for me.
But-
And then this is,
Who creates a folder in the composer bucket?
that's what Terraform is doing.
Okay, whenever
As a
tenancy
part of-
is set up, the folder is created.
As part of the tenant onboarding. I was gonna get to it like in the demo, but this is how like the whole plumbing, like I was talking about the plumbing piece. So there's this Terraform that creates the folder for you. And then this cloud function tapping into that and using the same exact formatting to assign that to the user.
So the cloud function reads the folder and gets the ID group and pulls the members and attaches to the.
Cloud function just reads the tenant trump file that the intake form leaves.
Oh, okay.
So every time a new tenant comes, it updates the tenant groups with that new tenant.
Oh,
So cloud function just, yeah.
it reads those
Yeah,
trump
so
file, gets ID group and
exactly.
numbers.
That invoke cloud DAG that I trigger in the composer is going to read that and then call the cloud function with all the list of the groups or a subset of it, whatever needs to be synced up. And then that's how the cloud function gets all the member details for those groups.
Got it.
So it kind of is a little tricky to kind of wrap it the first time, but then we need all this plumbing in place for it to seamlessly work. And it wouldn't fly well if Terraform is creating like ABC, but cloud function is giving it some other custom role, like the automation wouldn't work, saying that the role doesn't exist.
But where does this no tag issue come from? Because I see Terraform creates a folder and cloud function pulls those specific AD group members. And
Right. So that's a very good question. And as part of this whole preview, the auto register per folder, it's the core Flask app builder permission where it needs to know what's the default that should be assigned to a user if it doesn't come in with a preset list of roles. So if somebody just bypasses this whole thing and let's say even before some tenancy is assigned or onboarded, gets the URL to the web server, Airflow web server, and goes to that web server.
without logging to the GCP console.
No, without, well, you can still, it doesn't really matter if you log in or not.
Either you're totally anonymous or you really don't have permissions at that tenant level, but you still have an access to the URL. Now, how do you protect?
Right.
I am genuine identity, but I'm not part of any group. I'm not supposed to access URL. But at that point, I'm also considered anonymous, right?
Right. So there is this default. So the way this whole web server works is like on an app engine, and it's just an app running on the GKE. And so the only thing that's constricting the access to that particular user is what role you're assigned to. And ideally, it should be public, which kind of throws them off. But then we kind of created a user no DAG, or I think it's implicit in Composer too, wherein this user has access to the website only, but has no access to any DAGs. That's what
Website only, as in
he can just log in and he can still see all of that website stuff, but no access to any of the DAGs or any of the panels up top, like the tabs. So this is like a dummy role that we created that user can just go into just to, because when you assign public role, which should be, it throws an error that may confound our users. So just to, the assumption is like the tenancy onboarding happens and the sync happens and the user goes in with a preset list of rules so that he can look at his DAGs. But few people just out of hurry, or they get the bookmarked link from some of their peers, it directly bypasses this whole thing and go. That's how the no DAGs get assigned to them.
I think Airflow sits in different environment.
Yeah.
Rather than GCP.
Yeah.
Do you expect in your tenant to deploy daggers through CI/CD pipeline into your environment? Or you are totally not expecting that?
Right now, Jonathan, they are all deploying their DAGs, at least in the test and prod, using CI/CD.
And the CI/CD is built by A and B C team.
Yeah. We
And
have our
they-
custom Jenkins that Tony and team set up that runs on our GKE cluster, and that that knows exactly what where the tenant DAG should deploy their stuff. It's all wired. That we have our own GKE cluster.
So their dagger will not be just put into GCS bucket, but directly into your composer. Right? That's your saying.
Exactly. So Composer, again, the way we store the DAGs is in a GCS bucket. But what our CI/CD pipeline does is if some tenant is uploading his DAG and if it passes the compliance check, which I'll get to in a minute, upon successful compliance check, it knows exactly what tenant this DAG is part of and deploys it to that subfolder within the DAG. What I mean by that is, if you look at the, oh, okay. So if you look at the IEEE, this is the Composer GCS bucket, and it has this broad level DAX folder. And with the help of that override, if we create a folder here, it's going to create the corresponding role in the metadata database, which I was explaining. And then our CI/CD, if it belongs to tenant one, knows exactly where it puts the stuff here in this folder. So this tenancy can only look at these DAGs.
These DAGs. Okay, so it does put into. Is this a GCS bucket?
Yes,
Oh,
this is a GCS bucket. This is a GCS bucket.
Okay, so tenant, well, basically it's deployed into the GCS bucket, but this GCS bucket will be reflected into your cloud composer. Right.
It's deployed folder within the GCS bucket. That's where, yeah, every composer environment has a GCS bucket where it gets the DAGs out of, and a GKE that's running all the Airflow infrastructure. So the core of it, like scheduler has this concept of loading DAG back, which means like the number of DAG it should schedule and kind of make it visible on the UI. And that this is the centralized space where it goes and constructs that. Every time there's a new subset of DAGs that come in, the scheduler looks at that and then creates a new DAG bag with that new tag. So this is one location that it looks at. And here's where the bifurcation happens across multiple tenants. Like so if tenant one only has access to their tenant one DAGs, and this is what is separating it. Apart from creating the role, what that roles per folder feature does is it assigns that IAM permissions, as in like Airflow has its own set of permissions so that they can only view and trigger those within this DAG. It does nothing from the composer IAM standpoint, but Airflow has its own concept of our backend permissions. So but that
you still have to maintain region specific bucket perspective, though IAM is global. You still are creating location specific composer buckets.
All our composer right now are in East 4.
If I have a DR region, you still have to have the same.
I'll get to the DR part real quick, because Composer does this snapshotting. So where it gets everything, like you don't need to worry about all that. So you get a snapshot of time, and you can even go back as to what the state of the DAG was. But yeah, I don't need to worry. Yep. It doesn't need to, like I don't need to check at the region level.
Specific constructs that you get.
Yeah.
Because the roles are written more global, right?
Yep.
So your IAM role decide the tenant whether has the permission to put into this particular folder location.
Yep, this is where the GCP IAM permissions come into the play.
Yeah.
And as part of our tenant onboarding, we kind of tightly, so that no two tenants can go into each other's buckets and look at their DAGs, rather just they have only read permissions on their tenant.
So here you're applying the GCP IAM permission object folder.
I mean, I think they get the role assigned, right, at that point.
That's from the Airflow side. Yes, but from the composer side, from the GCP side of the world, this is where the IAM permission. They only have the list and then the get of at the storage object level on this folder. They won't be able to look at all the DAGs rather, but just their folder within that particular bucket. Any questions?
Once you are in the, let's say, a DR portion, I have some questions, but wait until you reach there.
All right. So for the next part of the talk, I'm going to be talking about this compliance checker. So why we even force our users to go via Composer is just because to kind of take advantage of this compliance checker package. And we want to be able to make sure that each tenant is using their specific service account that we have created for them, but rather not like it could, it's easy. Like right now we have some samples there, and it's easy for somebody to just put in some tenant. It's tenant 1 to tenant 2, and then, but there should be a mechanism for us to catch that and stop that from being deployed. So that is what our compliance checker does. And even with, as the slide says, we have zero trust policy, as in like we do not trust any time. So every time it happens on every event, like as in like a DAG update or a DAG create, DAG deletion, all of that, we make sure that they're referring to their resource service account. It's not just a service account, but it also goes to that extent, as in the other day there was a CVE for a vulnerability for Log4j, and all our Dataproc guys were using the image that had that vulnerability. So we kind of put in a check within our compliance checker package to go after those versions and to force people to not use those versions, rather just spit out an error saying like, hey, go with this safe, whatever, from the documentation, go with this. So there are multiple things you can do with it. This is a sophisticated, rather than using regexes to kind of go it, which may not work most of the time if it is parameterized or if it is kind of being pulled out from one. We rather went in in a way that compiler looks at the code. So every time Python code gets run, the compiler creates tokens, looks at the high level source code, breaks it into tokens, and creates something called ASTs. That so slowly kind of in its during its transition from a human understandable format to a bytecode, this is like the intermediate byproduct. And AST is a pip package too that comes with every Python installation, like every version of it has it. So it's got its own grammar. So what we're doing at the compliance checker is we try and convert every DAG file upon creation into an AST tree, walk every node of the tree and look for a couple of keywords. Service accounts being one, Dataproc versions, and multiple other stuff. This is also something that we use to make sure that every resource that is being created using Composer has a label on it, or else their tag won't be deployed and they won't be able to do anything. This is like the for sure way of stopping them and kind of introducing some best practices and some key checks within the way, along the way, kind of. A compliance checker, it's all Python written, and it's predominantly relies on the AST package, and it's tricky in a way. There's a huge learning curve, but it has two modules within it. One is the pure parser form, but that can be used across the board, like all of organizing can, because there's nothing specific to NBC. And there's the DAG checker part of it, wherein we have all these checks, and that is very specific to NBC naming, formatting, and all. So even if EDP needs to use it, I think we're in talks with a couple of them already. If EDP needs to use it, they can readily reuse the syntax parser, but then they may need to come up with their own checks to whatever rules they have in place. So this way they can kind of leverage some part of what we have, and they can get a heads up on this whole checking stuff. And this has been integrated within our Jenkins CI/CD pipelines too. So every time a DAG is getting deployed or from using Jenkins or from their DAG repo, GitHub repo, this gets run implicitly, and user get immediate feedback right within the Jenkins console, and it can go back and do all the changes required. So this is just a screenshot that I took. Like,
can I ask a question on this? So the compliance check is your team created, or to
yes,
let's say
we created,
right,
for
all tenants to verify whether their data is follow the compliance.
Yep.
Right.
Exactly.
Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Check as the bullet says, it checks to make sure that the other purpose, the biggest reason why we also enforce Composer is because we want to be able to control exactly what users or user base are using. Because there's Airflow, it being an open source, there are like a lot of people contributing to it, and we do not want to add that kind of. So we have like a way of controlling, like kind of dictating like what our users can use, and also in a way because we're slowly introducing one service at a time to our user base, we to make sure that Composer is only supporting those. So right now we have already whitelisted anything and everything about Dataproc, PubSub, and I believe data flow and all of that. And we only allow DAGs that conform to that naming pattern. So that's one thing that we're checking out apart from the service accounts. And as you can see, we're also checking for the log4j error, and we're making sure that anyone who's using older version of Dataproc cannot get their DAG deployed, ultimately stopping it from being run.
For this, right? Instead of this checker, I think you can further extend it to
Modify.
apply some kind of a global remediation kind of thing. For
Right.
example, this log4j, it's very evident, okay, I have to upgrade to version. There's no point.
Yep.
You can't do it, right?
Mhm.
So some cases you can get an acceptance from, whoever has to train the pipeline. So it's okay, am I allowed a checker to basically modify this package, right? So that confirmation you can get, but still you can extend your solution further to remediate as well.
Right. This is to put the whole control back in the developers, like the whole.
No, that I completely got. I'm just
Right.
saying it has.
Yes.
capability
So
to-
as you said, as you rightly pointed out, like AST cannot just be used to walk through and
Yes.
parse or gather the information. It can also, but it needs to be done with utmost care.
Yeah,
Because
That's why I told
yeah.
confirmation.
I think the next step, the ideal next step would be to kind of modify something that we deem as like, hey, this is just not allowed in it, and something like a Dataproc. If somebody is even going with an older version,
give
we
you
can just rephrase it and
give an example, right? If you wanted to make it actionable, especially for some clients, so checker does, it basically, creates a security finding, imagine an API, it creates security. So now you could make people actionable and stuff.
Yep.
Just notify. So now you're actually trying
Yeah.
to- So I think you have that power.
and we can do much more with it. Right now, we're just, as the name says, we're only limiting it to just checking part because we do not want to take on that
At
extra
some
thing
point you
about.
need to change it, I think.
Yeah, I think
Checker
very
too.
soon we are. But also with this, we're trying to kind of give them some util functions. Like right now, the user is kind of putting in their service account and all, but rather just give them some util functionality that this can understand and substitute it with your tenancy specific resource service account without putting it back.
Yeah.
So there's so much we can do it,
Yeah.
but this is just a starting
yeah.
point. And a quick mention to the impersonation chain. This is all Google provide anything and every operator that is Google provided operator within Airflow, only those support the impersonation chain. The reason why we went with it is to cut down on the setup per tenant. Ideally, how Airflow does is using connections within the metadata. It's like a JDBC string. It tells exactly what tenant should be using or which service account and what key. It requires service account keys and JSON files to be stored in metadata, which is there is another way of doing it, like using secret manager as a backend to it, but it's just not the way we fly because we do not want to introduce, and there's also a quota as to how many JSONs and how many service accounts we can per project, and we do not want to do that. Rather use impersonation chain to programmatically create tokens that are short-lived. The safest way to impersonate that to get the job done. We don't care. That saves us on the setup time too. Like I do not have to now go in every time I create a composer environment. I don't have to go in and create the thousands of service accounts and then add those JSON keys in the metadata database. So leveraging this impersonation chain cuts down on a lot of that red tape, like kind of like I don't need all of that. Rather, a user can just go ahead with his day-to-day tasks just by adding impersonation chain parameter within the operator. And compliance checker also make sure that any Google specific operator that these guys are tapping into has it specified. Or else it's going to, as if you can see, if you can look at
value of the parameter, it's just
the resource service account. Yep. And if you can look at the quick screenshot I shared here, the compliance checker looks at all the different tasks and operators that are being used within the tag, make sure that there is an impersonation chain parameter defined within the tag, or else it's going to say, hey, no impersonation chain. Like before even I go into checking the impersonation, the value that has been assigned, I need to make sure that impersonation chain is being used, or else by default it uses the composer service account, which has wider permissions.
And how do you update checker based on the latest CVE rules, right? So
Yeah.
you have some mechanism?
I think it's a pip package at the end of it. So we have our own pip Python. Yes. And these are a couple of errors that are all our user base, are all familiar with. And then the other way is, it makes no sense when we are putting so much of effort into this and making sure that impersonation chain is being added to every tag and all. If somebody can just add a bash script that can just work around this using some G-Cloud, because at the end of the day, whenever you run any command from Composer, it assumes the role of the Composer service account. which has wider permissions. So to cut down on that, we do not allow our users to run any G-Cloud commands or any such stuff from the DAG, but rather use client libraries so that they can impersonate to their resource service account and then tap into that particular service, even within a virtual environment operator.
So your compliance checker will make sure that no one is using the composer service.
Yes, yep, and G-Cloud or any of those functions that can be, duped into like thinking it's a service account, all that.
But from the tenancy model, what I observe is like each tenancy is tightly linked with one AD group and one resource service. Right?
Mhm.
Like, say within the tenancy, I want developers group and admins group. That kind of functionality cannot be achieved. I guess.
That depends on what you want to do with the resource service account.
So say like I want to have some audit on specific tables. I don't want developers to touch it. Only admin team within tenancy can update.
Mhm.
How would I achieve this? Like say
You can have them as part of a different AD group, and you can have a separate set of DAGs. And using the access control within your, or you can just have it assigned to to that particular group. The quick and easy way is, if I were you, I would just add that access control within my DAG and give that to the admin team guys, so that only those guys can view and trigger your DAGs that can tie with the.
so how would that happen? So say like a table level, I understand. Table level, you give admin
Mhm.
group and admin service account those right access.
Mhm.
But from composer point of view,
No, this is what I'm saying. Access control is this keyword. I think it's not yet been introduced to ANBC users, but we're soon going to. But that programmatically syncs.
it's at a DAG level.
Exact, at a DAG level.
Oh,
So even though, let's say, a tenant had 100 DAGs,
right.
you can still do that on just the 10 DAGs that you want admins to run.
Okay, that's customization. that you need to
Exactly,
do.
but also pushing the control back to the developer and not on the ops team.
Makes sense.
Can he manage with another IAM role? Okay, he has that IAM role has access to these tables.
Mhm.
And then now if you recognize that role, okay, this is coming with this role. So admins can actually use that run as, then they can do it. You have any kind of,
I didn't quite get it.
no, basically he can do the same thing, can define a separate role, right, from IAM side. IAM role he can define, and then,
Yeah,
Well-
that's the AD group.
Okay.
yeah, so no, I don't, it's not like, you already have a AD group, right? Now
Uh-huh.
if you associate this IAM role for that AD group, now nobody else can do, right? Now further you fine-grain into a role-based access in this AD.
I think I think
That is what-
composer works, yeah.
Yeah, that is
Composer-
what Composer
that's
is doing. Yep.
So basically for that admin AD group would have a specific composer role created,
Yes.
and those who are part of that role can see the tag in the composer.
Yes.
Correct. But how do you, who's creating that?
I think
Composer
ANBC
Yeah.
team will do it, right?
Yep. So that is what the
Because we need
automation
to put
does.
this
Like,
in
yes.
control,
Mhm. So every time we roll out a Composer environment, that is what we do. Like, we have all these automation scripts that, like DAGs, ideally that whatever is tapping into Airflow CLI gets run in
If the
Composer.
Composer creates, only Composer is allowed to create services.
No,
Not like that.
no. We use Terraform to create
So you have
any,
your own
yeah,
designated service accounts that you don't allow people to do and assume.
yeah. Mhm.
That's what your checker is doing. Or, let's say you have designated service accounts. for that.
In my case, like, we have a Composer default service account that we use to kind of set up the Composer environment. We don't want anyone else to assume that role. So that is what this compliance checker is prohibiting them from doing. Yes.
I think that request might be coming to your team. Like we need a separate admin service account having some right access to some specific tables,
Mhm.
but not the resource service account. Reason being, we don't want developers to mess with that table because
But
that table is.
There is a-
Right, but then we
That's a
don't need,
code.
you don't need a separate service account for that, but we can get to it later
Yeah.
once I'm done with this. But I'm gonna be doing a quick demo at the just to kind of show how this whole stuff works. Hoping Jonathan is still online. I hate this.
Oh, yes, I am. I'm
Right.
quietly watching, even have some questions want to
You are
ask.
ready off.
Yeah, so this is the Composer environment that I have just for the sake of this demo. And if you look at it, this is the web UI that I've been talking about. And in here, we have all of these are the automations that we trigger to kind of do the sync. And invoke Composer automation cloud function. This is what triggers the whole automation. This is what reads the tenant.groups text file from the Composer bucket, and then calls the cloud function, gets all of that, and then the sync happens. So if you look, is there a way I can?
This invoke, right? Is it you are doing in a schedule or it's event is triggering this? The AD change.
That
event
that
is
happens
triggering.
that happens at a schedule. Yep. Right now it's only running once a day because there's not a lot of movement happening anyways, and it can wait at least a day. And we do not want to kind of block the whole resources. We want rather tenants to do it, and we do it at the midnight, like as a maintenance job. If you look at this, you see my ID, and then there's some Composer service account that we use, but there's no test user just yet. But whenever I launch this job, I'm trying to add this other guy that's part of a test AD group, and this is what it does. I have the tenant group with that AD group specifically, and upon triggering this manually, it is going to run it, and then eventually add that user to the Airflow metadata. And
So instead of making it at the user level, then can we make it at the AD group level, like add all the members? in this
Airflow doesn't
AD
have the concept of group. It can only identify user because it ties it to your Google account, which is like where it's your unique ID that it generates.
They're asking you to
Yes. Yep. And then that needs to only happen at the user level. It cannot be happening at the group
So
level.
the cloud function will pull the user IDs, right? Can't we use those user IDs and add it to the Composer role?
That is what is happening. Like it's happening at the user level.
Tenancy access.
Yeah, it is happening. Even like that same user is going to get assigned multiple roles at the end of it.
Right, so currently.
It's happening at the user level.
Each user has to request separately, right? Instead of that.
Yeah, but I cannot make it so that, yeah. It needs to
And
be
the
happening
user-
at the user level because there are
At
like,
the AD group level, like,
No.
I want CCD to access it.
maybe in the future we will, but for now it is that. As you can see, like it kicked off Airflow, which is going to add that user, and maybe it already did. So as you can see, the test user got created and he got assigned the tenant 1 ABC because it's part of that AD group. And this is what happens. If he's part of the multiple groups, then he's going to get assigned multiple groups. So if I log in as that test user, which I cannot because it's just a dummy account, he can only look at those tenant 1 and from that ABC LOB tags within the Composer. There could be thousands of it, but I can only be looking at just his tenant specific, which you guys are all right now. And the other demo I have is, because I do not want to kind of get into this whole complication of Jenkins and all, I have another way of doing the compliance checker demo, which is in the dev, we have this concept of staging for those who do not have the GKE and the Jenkins tenancy set up yet. All they need to do is drop their, oh, come on. Just drop their DAGs in a staging bucket, which we create, and then the IAM permissions are accordingly adjusted so that they can all write into their folder.
Now you go to the bucket.
Yeah.
then you-
So this is a staging bucket that we created. And for the interest of time, I think we only have like one tenancy right now. And let's say he's trying to update it. We have a cloud router closely monitoring the create and destroy events of this thing. And based on that, there's a cloud function that triggers the compliance check logic. So every time a new file get uploaded, let's say I'm going to upload this. It's going to upload and then immediately kick off a cloud function, which we call DAG validation. And if you look at the logs, this is already run on just the event, and it tells you exactly what are all the errors. And this gets logged into their tenancies code bucket, so they have the input as to what went wrong. So I'm just going to, because this is a service perimeter, I'm going to open a GCP. I won't be able to show this, but.
So here is where you're using the logs into.
Yes.
Push it to production.
Mm-hmm. If you look at the
Battery.
yeah. It tells you that whatever DAG that I uploaded does not use the right tenant service account, but rather gives them like, hey, you need to use the tenant 1 or your specific tenant service account, and gives all the input about, like, it also talks about the data proc image version. Right now it's using 150, and it tells him like, you need to at least use 1553 in the safe versions, whatever we consider. It's doing a lot of checks that way, and also it goes to Yeah.
You don't have one of these.
Yeah. It also goes at the label. It tries to make sure that every resource that is being created gets a label assigned, just so that it helps us in the future chargebacks.
I see. So the compliance check actually block these kind of things and then
Exactly. So
log
this
it.
DAG won't be deployed, Jonathan, but rather he'd get a log file created within the tenant's code bucket. So every tenant get a code and a data bucket where they can store their code, and there is a log file with the DAG name in it, and then they can just look at if something happens. If they don't see their DAG on the Airflow web UI, then something happened with the compliance checker. So they can go back to the log and fix whatever we show them. So this happens on the fly. Yeah.
Yeah, does your compliance check has dry run mode or immediately just enforced mode?
Does the compliance? Oh, there is no dry run mode in us. We have it. It needs to block it. So, but maybe in the future we can give them. This is the feedback they're getting anyway. So.
Yeah. Because in general, Google has the concept called the dry run. Let's say ARG policy, or like policy control in GKE. They have called dry run. You can create a policy controller initially to try out, say this policy doesn't make sense, right? But without impacting existing workload. And then later on changed to enforce.
Yes, we have a dry run mode when we're running this compliance checker as part of our Jenkins workload, Jonathan. Like they can just do a dry run and then quickly get a feel for the compliance checker and see if that's going to work or not. Without having to deploy. So they have it as part of the Jenkins.
Yeah, dry run, the concept or enforce the concept was come out of the product from Google. So I was not even expecting you to create a customer solution on that. But if the cloud composer does not support that, then certainly you will use customer solution.
I think at that point, right? I mean, you need to open up checker as a util so that they can actually run as a dry run, or different ways to basically.
I think we can control it at a Jenkins point, just kind of give them a way of running their build with a dry run. Right now, we're just doing that. We are doing that. I think developers can make use of that instead of just trying to deploy it, just run dry run so that you get immediate feedback and then go change your DAGs.
Yes, that's good. That's even better because you move to the left.
I think we do not want to spend any more cycles on this interim process, but in the tactical solution we have, rather just focus on kind of
the solution is good. Yeah, the solution is good. Very good.
So that's about the compliance checker. Any more questions, Jonathan, or anyone in the room?
No, I just later on once you are talking about what is it called, DR scenario.
Right. We currently we're in the middle of migrating Composer from Composer 1 to Composer 2, and I think we're going to leverage Composer 2 snapshotting. Jonathan. Right now, we do not have any DR, but rather we have it all saved. Like we're going to create a new, do the hands-on way in Composer 1. Like the other day, we had to change our configuration, like bump up the number of nodes for our Composer 1 environment, and we had to do the migration ourselves. But in Composer 2, we're going to use something called snapshotting, wherein you can immediately download that snapshot and create a new environment without having to worry. It pulls all the latest DAGs and everything. It basically clones your environment, and you have two environments running.
I don't remember. It's maybe 10 minutes or 15 minutes, kind of every period of time it will create that snapshot. But do you foresee, let's say US East 4 Composer environment is totally down. I have to switch to US West.
The zone
region. I'm not sure, honestly. I'm not sure.
I think they still have that protection of multi-AZ, right? So
of course,
the whole region
going down is catastrophic.
I think you have like that happening. I was looking at the stats the other day, and I think it's like 2 a year for. It's still a lot for a prod, but then I think we'll have. Well, I think there was a good discussion about it in the roadmap with Google Composer folks, and they have some zonal. Kind of like an affliction, how you can like tie it to one zone, and if it is not available, you can quickly spin another one or something. Like there is something going on with that.
I talked to Google. They are saying basically exactly as you said. Honestly, a whole region going down, that's kind of unimaginable. And
Yeah.
and
Because, I mean, you can't forget about this,
even a
right?
zone.
None of the other region-based services will work, right? Now, what do you do? So technically, right, you
Yeah.
shut the shop.
Let's say even if you're a zoner, you're just a zoner. If it's a failed, if you try again without do anything, let's say intermittent, without do anything, it may just come back works. So
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure. Really, you need to create another region like in US West to do so. That's my
No, but
gut
I
feeling.
think your question, but I'll ask a different way. A lot of the folks, primary region is US eastbound, right?
Right.
In
I
all
think
cases,
our policy, that's
primary
really
can
the-
be west.
Yeah.
Now, at the time, your snapshot is, the way snapshotting will be different, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's where it gets tricky.
I don't remember exactly, but there was an implication as they were gonna do something like we have a snapshot in different, spin up something in a different region faster, but then there's going to be a downtime for sure.
You will have
Yeah.
agency at that point. Not all services, right?
Mhm.
That's where.
And hopefully very soon, I think Composer is going to be very much like a serverless stuff.
But-
So we don't have to manage.
Health checks you have.
Access Slack from the other side.
Well, I don't need to do, that's the beauty of Composer, wherein all of the back end of it is a GKE, and Composer makes sure that it's always it's always ready and available.
Within the GKE?
Oh, no,
Where is it
the,
checked?
all of the airflow scheduler and everything is on a GKE. So every time you
Okay.
spin up a Composer environment, there is a GKE that gets spun up with, along with the environment.
So you have the health.
And I have
checks
no-
from GKEs.
And especially moving on to Composer 2, you have no control on that GKE class. It's completely controlled by Google folks. As in, like,
Exactly.
yeah, so
Yeah.
it's autopilot, it scales up to your usage, it scales it down if there is like not a lot of activity in it.
I know
But-
you had that should have joined it.
So it's all of that is kind of slowly moving away from us to the Google. And I think very soon they're gonna kind of probably even the whole web server and everything, all that will be left within Composer is just the monitoring, because they're gonna do all of it themselves.
They do not say they are going to want you to touch this GKE. under the
Exactly, they
hood.
don't want us messing
Yes.
with it, just like how
Yeah.
in Airflow Composer 1 either, like we do not have
Mhm.
any control on the metadata database, like all of it is coming from the tenant project, which is Google maintained, like Google IP space and everything, so I
Google
cannot
hosted.
really, there is no RBAC on our Airflow, because I cannot
It
get to
doesn't-
it,
yeah,
yeah, I cannot. Except for few operations from the Composer, like how we're like adding custom rules and stuff, hence the whole preview feature about creating the custom rules also, like they gave us a way of creating it, but we're not there creating it manually.
Want to-
Yes.
We can't create our own.
No.
Want to
Well,
know,
there is
have
a
you?
way to create it, but they don't want us to touch on that.
Yes. Want to know, have you tried using Composer to interact with serverless data proc? Or not yet?
No, I haven't done that yet.
They don't
Even
have
the
need.
serverless data, yeah,
You have a need.
yeah.
Enable or it-
No,
I don't think we
It's a
never
need, right?
really
It's a
tried.
need.
Definitely
really
a
want
need
it.
for us.
Yeah. It'll be a nice to have.
Yeah,
Serverless-
EDP team tried serverless data proc, but they have not integrated with Composer yet.
Oh,
So still in demo. Yeah, not integrated with. So that's why I asked this
But
question.
what are
You
the,
guys already
how-
done that.
what are the use cases you're trying to solve, Jonathan? At
from
that point?
serverless, like,
The use case is that today your Composer can trigger as an orchestration flow to trigger data proc, but there's another flavor of data proc called serverless data proc, which is becomes hands-free. And if you have a Composer to trigger serverless data proc, that will also save you your effort.
No, correct, but are you seriously thinking from the optimization, I mean, like from the cost optimization standpoint? Or
From operation perspective, ease of operation, right?
Okay.
I think kind of makes sense because we do not want, like how I was showing in the previous screen, I had my whole data proc cluster configuration right within the DAG, kind of minimalizes on all of that. Like, hey, just one
People
clip.
don't need to worry
Yeah.
about
I think all of it is going to go when we have the shared VPC subnets. But again, I don't know how it's going to tie with the data proc because we may not have the IPs that we're requesting.
Oh, serverless
No,
needs a shared
serverless is
VPC.
always beneficial. I mean,
Yeah, especially if you're like trying to interact services, like if you want something from GKE to tap into Composer, like right now, Composer is on it's on its own, like in an island, like nothing else. So yeah, I think shared VPC is going to solve a lot of the connectivity issues that we see around network.
It will give us back the unused IPs.
We are
PSP,
using
yeah.
shared VPC, right? You guys are using shared
In
VPC.
Composer 2, yes, we will.
You will. Okay.
Well, we are still in the middle of migration, Jonathan. Like we do not have like a Composer 2 for our developers yet. We're still waiting a couple of services and
That point you must kind of happens for
yes, we may soon be doing, yep.
Yeah, shared
We may have
VPC,
like
you only,
multiple composers, but still group a couple of
Nice, yeah.
tenancies.
It's kind of a hub and spoke where
hub
I
in, yeah.
share these
hub and
VPC.
spoke, yeah.
Mhm.
So I have a /18 or /16 in the hub, and then I just slice and dice the cider
Yeah.
put it here, like so something like that.
But having a compliance checker kind of is going to help us across multiple, even any which way. Like there is always going to be a need for this to quickly test, like, hey, if there's anything, violating something. There we go.
Yes, just like a guardrail.
Yep.
Yeah, and even you give early feedback during the CI process.
Exactly. Yep.
Mhm.
This may not that we are trying to set them up for success. This may not complete, like this only checks it from the like all the checks that we have in place, but they may be able to deploy their DAGs, but they may still not be able to use it because this doesn't have the concept of Airflow DAG in the context of it. But that's upon the developers.
You can enhance.
Yeah, there's a lot of
I'll
enhancements.
talk to you from the enterprise standpoint.
But any other
do you
questions?
guys need to interact with Tidal, which is like a CVS unique on-premise?
I think we have like a story
scheduler.
or so, or a request. I think we're soon going to be, at least in the shared VPC, once we have a Composer 2 with shared VPC subnet, we're going to try and interact with Tidal. But I think I did it once when I was doing it on-prem, Jonathan. Like I had I think Richard is the guy who I worked with, and he was trying to